this presentation is not on reparations per se, but it's an in-depth look at whether and how redress is possible through non-judicial redress mechanisms. So this is redress for harms perpetrated by multinational businesses. And it's work that's certainly very much collaborative, and so I'd need to acknowledge my co-authors, Tim Connor, Kate McDonald and Shelley Marshall, and also Annie Delaney, who's involved in much of the field work in India. Okay, so in this area, as many of you have been aware, there's been decades of struggle. And the struggle has been against the multinational businesses to gain redress from death, illness, poverty, wages, ecological disaster, cultural devastation, displacement, loss of land, conflict, and so on. So many and varied types of human rights abuses that have been perpetrated by multinationals. And it's not just multinationals, but it's businesses also along their value chain. And this is an area that's had considerable attention at every single level. So you've had many, many different kinds of initiatives here. Obviously, the resulting in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the John Ruggie process, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises that led to the National Contact Point system. You've had modern slavery laws. Now there's a growth of mandatory business and human rights due diligence, not to mention industry initiatives and multi-stakeholder initiatives, right? So this area is full of effort. I guess that's the point I want to get across. And non-judicial redress mechanisms are one in that effortful place. But progress is slow and impunity remains. It's quite some time ago now, 10 years or more, that we started to look at non-judicial redress mechanisms. And the monograph on the research is finally coming out this year with Cambridge. But at the time that we started this, non-judicial redress mechanisms were the flavour of the month, right? This was what was going to bring about either mediated settlements or reporting, compliance reporting of various kinds to basically hold, to an extent, hold multinational, transnational businesses accountable. But you know, since that time, there's been considerable work on them, and all the flaws and problems associated with them have come to the fore. But nonetheless, we argue that it's worth looking at what we can learn from these non-judicial redress mechanisms. The broader research has 10 cases. The paper that this is based on has 5 cases. These are the land-based cases. In the interest of time, I can only go into 2 of them, and I'm going to focus mainly on the first. This is a case of palm oil plantations in Jambi, West Kalimantan, and in Sumatra, Indonesia, associated with the largest oil producer, palm oil producer, Wilmar, involving mass loss of livelihoods, cultural, indigenous rights due to the encroachment of palm oil plantations. Now, in this case, there was a long history of struggle associated with palm oil, and one of the prongs of that struggle were grievances taken to the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, that is the body responsible for monitoring the activities of the International Finance Corporation and the Multilateral International Guarantee Agency, basically the private arms of the World Bank. Now, what happened in the case of Wilmar, you had in two of the areas, you had some mediated settlements, and in the grander scheme of our 10 cases, this was a relatively positive outcome, some regaining of land, plus plasma projects. These are small holdings that then could be owned by the communities and then sell the palm fruit to the processor. However, there was no such success in Jambi. I want to contrast this with Weda Bay. Weda Bay is on Halmahera Island, in a very remote area of Indonesia, and it has the largest deposit of laterite nickel in the world. I think I'm right in saying it was a joint venture between French company Aramet, Mitsubishi, and also Wedderburn Nickel, which was Indonesian. Indonesian law requires 51% ownership. They again went to the CAO, but in that case there was no outcome. Now, in our research, we basically wanted to sort of look at the institutional design and see if something about the CAO could determine what happened and why. But essentially what we've concluded is that institutional design is basically has a minimal impact on the outcome of complaints that are taken to these various types of non-judicial mechanisms. Rather, what's important is to look at the struggle itself and the field that surrounds a particular struggle, whether it's the struggle against palm oil in Indonesia or the struggle against the Wedderburn nickel mine, whatever the struggle is. And in that case, then, where a struggle is happening really matters. Right? So you've got to look at the geographical, economic, political, cultural, and social nature of inequality as it is experienced in that place, because inequality is structured differently depending on place. And to understand that a non-judicial mechanism is not the forum, right? It is not the central. It is one part of that struggle, and that the non-judicial mechanism does not enter a blank space. In developing this concept of a field of struggle, many of you would be familiar with it from the work of Bourdieu. We combined the work of Bourdieu with Fligstein and Buchanan, and looking at a field as a contested space where the inequality is structural within that place itself. There is a joint aim in that struggle. And what I mean by a joint aim in this case is to determine what is an appropriate response of the multinational business in this case, right? So that's the aim. The resolution of that is contested, but there is, if you like, a joint purpose in this place, right? In a particular field, you have rules of the game. Now, I was asked at lunchtime, are laws rules of the game? Well, in some cases, laws are rules of the game. In some cases, they're strategies. So the rules of the game can be legal, they can be normative, they can be cultural, right? They're the rules by which the struggle takes place, right? What is critical in this is understanding where the boundaries of the struggle lie. And the reason the boundaries are important is because boundaries determine which actors are seen as legitimate in the field. So if the boundaries expand, you may get more actors coming in and seen as legitimate. If jurisdiction is shrunk or boundaries shrink, then certain actors will no longer have a voice in that field. So understanding the push and pull of boundaries becomes very important. In understanding the nature of the struggle, of course, you have to understand the nature of power in that space. So you've got to understand material and discursive power with respect to the businesses themselves. In terms of state power, you have to understand the power of sovereignty, coercive powers, cause, legislative, and regulatory and administrative forms of power that states have. Now, the business power and the state power, if you like, are both independent but interdependent with one another. So I'm rushing because I've got 15 minutes and I'm probably running out of time already. How much have I got?
You've got another 6 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, fine. So with that concept of a field of struggle, how do we understand what went on at Wilma? And I'm going to put success in inverted commas. What determined why there was some relatively beneficial outcome? What you need to understand in terms of the communities and their allies, there was relatively strong solidarity. There was solidarity both at the local level, but there was also solidarity between the local, the national, and the international. So there was a way in which the communities and their allies could push back. That community solidarity was not the case in Jambi. There was significant conflict over what the communities wanted from the Wilma operations. There were sources of countervailing power in that place. Unilever and Wilmar had a commitment to corporate social responsibility. You're right to be skeptical, but it's a source of leverage, right? You can point to hypocrisy. At Jambi, it was a different arm of Wilmar, and they did not have the same level of commitment. There was a history of peasant organising. There was discursive power that could be used. Wilmar was a member of the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. Again, another source of leverage. And then internationally, there was the 2008 EU Renewable Energy Directive that came in and formed part of the rules of the game and also allowed different strategies to take place. Critically, the CAO as a non-judicial mechanism does not have enforcement power, right? But it does have jurisdictional power. So in other words, by accepting the claim, then the international actors were able to join the struggle as legitimate actors, but also they gave voice to local actors, who at that point had been able to be ignored by the Indonesian federal and state and national governments. They were given a greater voice. So, but again, there was pushback by the community, by the businesses, and they basically wanted to shrink the boundaries as much as they could. They didn't want to deal with palm oil writ large. They wanted to deal with palm oil in this place, and this place. So they reduced 10 claims to 3, right? So there's this pushing and pulling of the boundaries that was really important to understand. What happened at Jambi was very important. Wilmar decided to sell that part of its operations. Because it sold that part of its operations, the CAO no longer had jurisdiction, and therefore nothing came of it. Weda Bay was a very different case. It was very remote. The claim was actually made by the Allies, not by the communities themselves. The Allies basically wanted ecological aims, the community wanted compensation. So there was a conflict between the parties. There was also a history of conflict on the island itself. There was a very weak understanding of CSR by Aramet, which meant that the leverage afforded was much lower. And the history of peasant organising in Indonesia writ large did not extend to Halmahera Island. So the local people and their claims could be seen as not knowing what was good for them. Essentially, a kind of a quote-unquote backward type of discourse. There was a temporary reprieve because the price of nickel declined. So Weda Bay nickel did not go ahead at that point. It is now flourishing. So again, the rules of the game were determined in part by market conditions. In this context, the CAO went to the island and tried to see if they could do mediation. In the end, they said, this mine is not in operation. We're not going to take any part. And that was a catastrophic decision on behalf of the CAO. They basically absented themselves from the field. In absenting themselves from the field, then the boundaries of the field of the struggle changed and different actors were delegitimated, if you like. So the boundaries remain determined by the businesses involved and the state. So in conclusion, what we're arguing is in order to understand these endemic struggles, in our own work, it's really important to understand the inequality that's characteristic of place and field, the relationships within the field, what the particular relationships are between communities and their allies, businesses and the state. And a focus on boundaries and the rules of the game and actors give a dynamic sense of what is going on, and also what the potential sources of leverage are and aren't. What is likely to be effective and what is simply going to be a waste of resources. So what are the implications for reparations? And this is just not my area. So these are just some thoughts. You know, what is the possibilities of understanding the push for reparations as particular fields of struggle in particular places at particular point in time? So I'm thinking of Torres Strait and the claims there as a particular field of struggle that need to be understood sure, is connected to other struggles, but also as important because there are particular contextual features that need to be understood. So a field of struggle approach really focuses on understanding what's the joint aim here. There's going to be debates about how that's resolved. That's the struggle itself, but what's going on here? The need to identify what the main influences on the rules of the game are, where the boundaries lie and the struggle over boundaries, the push and pull, that then determines which are the legitimate actors in the field. Understanding who the allies are and the relationships between them and whether they share goals or whether there's conflict and problems there. But also understanding that when a claim is made to an institution like the Human Rights Commission or other potential avenues, to understand that they are entering a field, right? And so a claim to the Human Rights Commission in this case may not be central. The Human Rights Commission may well be peripheral in this field, but understanding whether and how, or if not, or the conditions under which that claim may provide additional leverage, I think may help in this area too. And so I'm just going to leave it there.